This is an AQA Psychology A-Level revision video for the Paper 2 topic of approaches with a specific focus on the cognitive approach. So to get started, let's have a look at the specification and making sure we understand where the cognitive approach sits in the bigger picture. So the cognitive approach consists of various different elements. So you have to be aware of the study of internal mental processes, the role of schema, the use of theoretical and computer models to explain and make inferences about mental processes, as well as the emergence of cognitive neuroscience. So there's a number of different elements that make up the cognitive approach. And so we will start by examining the main assumptions, everything that underpins all of these little subheadings that we're going to go through in this video. So starting with the main assumptions and how it builds on behaviourism. The cognitive approach emerged after behaviourism, and it was a reaction against their stimulus response approach, this idea that behaviour is caused by a stimulus and that we respond to it, that very simple idea of behaviour. So cognitive psychologists care more about how thinking and knowing shape our behaviour, how all of these different mental processes inside of our brain take place and affect our behaviour. So for cognitive psychologists, it's all about what happens within a person, the private processes, our thoughts, our memory, our attention, perception, etc. And they believe it's those things that need to be studied to understand behaviour fully. So they then take that forward into a scientific approach and believe that mental processes can be studied scientifically. So they often will make use of experiments and observations, any sort of empirical method like those too. And finally, they believe that human processing is similar to that of a computer. So the computer is used as a metaphor or an analogy for the mind, which we're about to explore in more detail. So the computer metaphor is used to underpin this belief from the cognitive approach that the human mind, human brain works just like a computer. So they suggest information flows through a cognitive system in a sequence of stages. And I'll refer to the multi-store model a lot in the cognitive approach because it is the perfect example for you to understand what a computer metaphor is, but also the use of theoretical models and inferences in human behaviour. So the cognitive approach believes that the brain is a central processor, and then we code, just like a computer, we organise information into different stores. So the computer metaphor has really benefited the wider world, the wider economy, through the development of artificial intelligence. This belief that if the human mind is like a computer, then the computer can also be like a human mind. And here we have things like ChatGPT nowadays. So that's all a result of cognitive research and, these thinking machines, things like self-scanning machines at supermarkets, etc. So just looking at the theoretical and computer models in a bit more detail, these models are used to help cognitive psychologists understand these internal mental processes because, of course, we can't actually see people's thoughts, we can't see people's attention or perception. They're not concrete things. Now, one of the really important things you need to get your head around is the difference between a theoretical model and a computer model. So if we start with computer models, they are the abstract models. They are based on the information processing approach, so that input, process, output, which describes the way computers function and suggests that information flows through those stages of input, process, storage, output, retrieval, etc., the same way that a computer works. So the multi-store model can be an example of that, in that, I'm not going to go through the whole multi-store model, but if you just have a brief look at it there, you've got that input from the environment that arrives and flows through a sequence of stages all the way to your long-term memory. And then if we move across to computer models, now the thing to distinguish the difference here is that computer models are based on more concrete. These are concrete models, these are actual models, which involves programming a computer to see if instructions provide a similar output to humans. And if they do, then we can suggest similar processes do occur in the human mind and that we are like computers ourselves. So computer models have been very useful, as I've mentioned, because they've contributed towards the development of artificial intelligence, thinking machines, these self-scanning machines at supermarkets that basically do what a human does. But then the wider implication of that is that they do take jobs away from humans. So it's a double-edged sword there, in that the cognitive approach has been very useful with these computer models. It's helped with various different things. However, it can lead to that loss of human thought and human process, for example, in supermarkets. So we take this further into how these computer and theoretical models help make inferences about mental processes. So this is all based on this idea that your mental processes are things you can't actually see. So the cognitive approach makes inferences. They make reasoned conclusions. So that is what an inference is. Reasoned conclusions about how mental processes like memory work, and they base those conclusions on observable behaviour. That is because the cognitive approach recognises that they can't study mental processes directly. They understand that you can't see thoughts and you can't see memory, but you can study them indirectly by making inferences, inferring what goes on as a result of observable behaviour. So again, perfect example is the multi-store model, understanding that short-term memory has a duration of 30 seconds or a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 items, because you are basing that on observable behaviour through experiments where you get people to remember lists of words or lists of numbers or trigrams. And so inferences allow those cognitive psychologists to create theories and models, like the multi-store model, which is an inferred representation of human memory. So that is your best example to use if asked about inferences. But of course, in the exam, they could give you some made-up examples and ask you to explain what an inference is using that made-up scenario. Moving on to the next part of the cognitive approach, which is the role of schemas. If you just have a quick read over these images. So if you have noticed, this first one actually reads Paris in the spring, so there's two thes. Second one reads once in a lifetime, so there's two A's. And the final one is bird in the hand, so there's two thes. Now, if you didn't spot those sort of grammatical mistakes, if you like, that is due to schemas. Schemas can be very useful because they allow us to process information very quickly. So you might have been able to read those 3 sentences very, very quickly. However, they do cause us to make faulty conclusions and can lead to some quite unhelpful behaviour. So let's have a look at schemas in a bit more detail. So a schema, by definition, is a packet of information. It's a mental blueprint. It's what we use to organise and interpret information about the world. We base it on previous experience. So we can often add and amend our schemas, and we do that on a day-to-day basis. You are adding to your schema of the cognitive approach by watching this video. And so schemas are all about evolution with experience. Basically, they get bigger or they get more refined based on experience. They can become more detailed, more sophisticated. And so the idea is that babies are born with very simple motor schema, and that's why babies just tend to explore the world through their mouths. But then as they get older, they add to their schema and they understand that certain things don't belong in their mouths because they don't taste very nice or feel very nice. So schemas are very useful because they can allow us to make shortcuts in thinking. You know, we all understand what a chair is, the purpose of a chair, and so we sit down when we see a chair. It helps us to process that vast amount of information in the world or in a room and process it very quickly. But the problem with that is that they lead to faulty conclusions and unhelpful behaviour. So a lot of the time, schemas for exams might be that they're difficult and scary, and so people can get into that unhelpful behaviour of a panic attack before an exam because that is what their experience is of an exam, that it's a negative thing, etc. So there's just an opportunity for you to think and use these 2 images to help you of schema of a dog and how that might affect someone's behaviour. So I'll give you 5 seconds to think about that. So if someone has a schema of a dog that is cuddly, soft, gentle, cute, etc., they're going to respond to that dog positively, pet it maybe, maybe have a dog of their own and be very positive about dogs, respond to them positively. However, if someone has a scheme for a dog that they're very aggressive, maybe that they're not very attractive, that they're dangerous, etc., that's going to affect their behaviour and how they respond to dogs in the future. And they might cross the road when they see one, they might even have a panic attack, they might develop a phobia of all dogs, and that is a faulty conclusion because all dogs aren't necessarily dangerous, but that having that schema of a dog behaving in that way can affect how someone responds to the dog. And then finally, the last section of the cognitive approach is cognitive neuroscience. Now, I do have a separate video on this, so I'm just going to summarise cognitive neuroscience very briefly before we move on to evaluate the cognitive approach. So cognitive neuroscience is that blended approach of the cognitive approach, this idea that it's all about internal mental processes, things we can't necessarily physically see, but then neuroscience, which is that brain science, that scientific aspect of study in the brain. So by definition, cognitive neuroscience is the scientific study of the brain structures that underpin these internal mental processes that we can't see. So it is about recognising specific areas of the brain and specific behaviours that they are linked to. So, for example, as early as the 18th century, you had Paul Broca, who identified where in the brain was responsible for speech production, and that is the frontal lobe, specifically Broca's area, which he named after himself. And then also developments in technology have led to brain scans like fMRIs and PET scans, which have allowed the systematic study of the neurological basis, the brain basis of mental processes, such as where certain memories are stored. So if you want to know more about cognitive neuroscience, please do go and watch my video dedicated specifically to cognitive neuroscience, where there is enough information for an essay question on cognitive neuroscience if you are ever asked one. And so to finish the video, we're going to have a look at some evaluation of the cognitive approach. So here is an opportunity for you to pause the video and think about some strengths and weaknesses of the cognitive approach. In 5 seconds, we'll go through the answers. So for strengths, we've got the fact that it is a very scientific approach. They emphasise the use of lab experiments where there's high control, they can be reliable, they collect and evaluate evidence based on inferences, and so they can gain very objective data. There's also a lot of practical applications or real life applications for the cognitive approach, treatments for mental illness through cognitive behavioural therapy, and also the economic implications of, reducing staff force through self-scanning machines, etc. But that can also be a negative if you wanted to make that a negative as well. And then, of course, cognitive neuroscience. We have a lot of developments. We understand the brain, we understand thoughts and behaviour a lot more now because of the cognitive approach and their development of neuroscience. However, a really important criticism is machine reductionism. So the cognitive approach is reductionist to some extent, and that is because it really simplifies human behaviour to that of a computer. There are a lot of things that humans have that separate them from computers, and so to simplify human behaviour to that of a computer which humans created themselves is an issue, because computers don't have emotion, they don't have motivation, they don't have hormones, which are all things humans do. So we are going to behave very differently to that of a computer. And then, of course, the reliance of lab experiments, that use of lab experiments far too much, which means that there is a lack of ecological validity in the findings because they wouldn't represent everyday life, and therefore you can't generalise those findings. So I'm going to take each one of these points, not all of them, but just some of these points, and put them into some pure paragraphs for you on the next slide. So this is an opportunity for you to pause and jot down how you would add evidence and explanation to these evaluation points. And in 5 seconds, we'll look at my peels. Okay, so the pink is to represent the point, the orange is the evidence, the green is the explanation, and the purple is the link. So the first one, this idea that the cognitive approach is a very dominant approach in psychology today. It's been applied to a wide range of contexts, psychopathology, and explaining depression, which has led to the the development of cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a really common treatment, and it's not just for depression. CBT can also be used for schizophrenia, it can be used for phobias, and so it's got very useful and worthwhile real life applications. So I'll just go through and underline some key elements of that for you. Okay, so it's those underlined words that you really want to make sure you articulate in your PL paragraph to get your point across to the examiner, that you understand why and how the cognitive approach is useful. Secondly, the cognitive approach has always been very rigorous in its methods of study to enable researchers to process and to infer cognitive processes. So the use of lab experiments produce reliable and objective data. For example, as mentioned earlier in this video, the research into the multi-store model, it's always been very highly controlled. It's allowed cause and effect to be established. They've been very scientific and objective in their planning of these studies. So this means the cognitive approach to the study of the mind is credible and scientific. And you can then flip that with the weakness about how the studies can lack ecological validity, and you could even refer to machine reductionism in there if you wanted to. However, the third and final appeal is machine reductionism. So by comparing the human mind to a computer, the cognitive approach offers a simplistic explanation of human behaviour. Although there are similarities between the human mind and the operations of a computer, the computer analogy means that there is machine reductionism. It ignores the influence of things unique to humans, such as hormones, emotion, and motivation. And again, you can add your knowledge from the biological approach there in terms of aggression and how aggression could be linked to the frontal lobe, like Phineas Gage, or even testosterone, the hormone. Which means the cognitive approach might not be completely useful to explain human behaviour. So I'm just going to go through and underline the key points from both of those PL paragraphs and conclude the video. So there you can see the key elements that you should be including in a PL paragraph for the cognitive approach, with rigorous methods, lab experiments, trigrams and distraction tasks, scientific basis, but lack of ecological validity. Then when arguing it's simplistic, you need to refer to machine reductionism, you need to refer to the ignorance on hormones, emotion and motivation, and refer to it not being a completely useful explanation of human behaviour. So that concludes this video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found it useful.